PlexTrack is the platform that guides the healthy collaboration of red and blue teams to get the daily security work done. Red teams can create reports in half the time and track risk to resolution with the blue team. Blue teams can centralize remediation efforts across all scans, assessments, and audits through simple visualizations of risk, scanner, and ticketing integrations. Enhanced analytics allow you to effectively communicate risk in real time. PlexTrack is perfect for remote collaboration across all teams. Visit securityweekly.com/PlexTrack to claim your free month today. The biggest problem in security that remains unsolved is flat networks inside the cloud and data center that allow threats to move laterally and compromise vulnerable targets. But microsegmentation using traditional firewalls is too complex and time-consuming. There's a better approach: Edgewise Zero Trust Auto Segmentation. Edgewise is impossibly simple microsegmentation. Using the identity of machines and software that are communicating, Edgewise offers the strongest protection that adapts automatically to changes. Protect any application in any cloud without any changes to your network by visiting securityweekly.com/Edgewise. Well, welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Make sure you join our Security Weekly mailing list by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe. We are, actually, just talking about this in the break, beginning to roll out access to our public Discord channel. We've actually already started to do so, and if you've been involved in any of the recent communications, you are likely already in our Discord channel, which is growing daily. So if you would like to get the official invite, join our mailing list, securityweekly.com/subscribe, and eventually you'll see that on social media as we start to, again, slowly roll out access to that channel. And I've just been having fun in Discord and the various channels and sharing information. And I think, especially given the times where we are all quarantined to some extent, that having an additional form of communication both with each other, fellow hosts and coworkers, but also now with our listeners as well, I think is very much welcome. And I look forward to communicating with all of our subscribers and listeners via Discord. As many of you know, email and other forms of communication with me especially can be very spotty. So I've kind of made the pledge to make sure that I stay active in Discord. So already using it for good stuff. I tend to play matchmaker too. Like people looking for hire people and people who are looking for jobs, I try and help both those folks out. So it's one of the things we can do with a public chat communication medium. So in this segment, I would like to talk about, specifically 4 different topics amongst us here as hosts on the show, and then transition into a VMDR demo from Qualys. Qualys has really extended their platform and are doing all these things inside of their commercial platform, which, having worked in vulnerability management, to see this kind of take shape in the way that Qualys has done it, I think is really cool. So there is very much a very product-specific application and demo of this on the Qualys platform. Before we get to that, I wanted to kind of have the general discussion as to why are some of these things important, how we maybe accomplished those things in the past and today with various different tools before we transition into the Qualys kind of approach to what we're going to talk about, which is asset management, vulnerability management, prioritization of vulnerabilities and remediation, and patching. So starting with asset management, I think we all know why it's important, right? Because you can't secure what you don't know about. And as I think back as to how we accomplished this in the past and today, there are some differences, right? I used to employ tactics such as, every time I would run a scan, I'd want to know about new hosts that weren't in the previous scan. And I think really early on, really the Windows firewall and things like that kind of killed that off, right? And that was, I think, in the early 2000s when you kind of flipped to, where else can I turn to get accurate representations of what's on my network now, let alone that everyone's working from home and you have 8 different cloud providers and hosting providers and things like that and cloud applications. Your asset management is a complex system. So I used to rely on things like DHCP and DNS, right? Who's querying DNS? Who's getting DHCP addresses? I think locally on the network, in addition to passive sniffing to see maybe who's going to an update server, right? Haven't seen that IP address before. So there are ways to accomplish this on the local network. I think it gets complicated when we step outside some of these boundaries.
See, and I would have to say that you're spot on with like how you did it in the past, but I think you were well well ahead of your own time there, because often we see, even in decent sized organizations or even well funded organizations, the asset management is very, very complex. It's very, very granular, and it's all on a spreadsheet.
Oh.
And
See,
that
now
may
I
be just
thought-
because people write that in there, and it's not necessarily collection.
Right.
But this is still very, very common. That's one of the number one findings that come out. It is one of the biggest problems that sysadmins and the security team actually have a big problem with this, because they're relying on sysadmins or infrastructure admins or the DevOps team to let them know that they got this new Mac Mini server that they put into their dev pipeline and environment. Like, these things aren't happening, and it's still being heavily relied on, like using spreadsheets and like the manual entry. So I think you're right on for many of those places that are doing really good security and maybe are very technologically adept. But that's still not
You're really scaring
case.
me, Tyler, because we maybe have a couple of dozen systems here at Security Weekly on the local network, and we do very much use a spreadsheet. I think now it might be a Confluence table, right? And Johnny and I have been working over the past few weeks to make sure that's up to date. And even with a couple of dozen systems, John and I look at each other and be like, wait, what was that? What is that system over there? Is it still online? And what is it doing, right? And now, again, I'm talking about like literally maybe 20 to 30 systems. And what you're saying
That's
is
not
there
even
is
your cloud systems,
right, and that's not even the cloud systems, right? That are in potentially three different, like I think DigitalOcean, Linode, and AWS, right? Got to make sure I keep tabs on which one I had spun up, spun down.
In the other one.
Yeah, exactly, right. And then forget about containers, which, I mean, in a lot of this new infrastructure, the IP address, the host name, like that doesn't exist. It's a resource, right? It's an asset, to go back to our RDS article from the news segment, right? It's the IP addresses and things aren't really all that useful anymore. But it comes down to, there are enterprises with not hundreds but thousands using spreadsheets. Like, that's kind of scary.
Yeah.
So,
if not more than thousands. Like, you start to see pretty colors and tables and management interface columns and tabbed sheets all the way across for multiple environments. And again, very, very common. See it in more places than I care to admit.
Oof. Jeff?
So, couple questions and a comment or two, if I may. And first, just to clarify, one of my pet peeves is we talk about things without starting with a definition, and so we're left with whatever anybody thinks these things mean. So, just very quickly, Paul, or anyone for that matter, just a quick working definition of asset management.
Yeah, it's a great point, Jeff, because I think there's multiple different ways in which you could describe an asset, or an asset.
Spin it.
Yeah, right. Like what we were talking about largely were IP addresses and host names that may relate to actual physical systems, right? And then maybe virtual systems.
So inventory,
right? That extends to, I think hardware asset inventory is separate, right? So I know that there's an asset tag on a laptop for every employee. That's a different aspect of asset management, certainly, right? To know that the asset tag of this laptop is assigned to this user. That's yet another thing you have to track in an enterprise, which is horrible and always has been. It probably still is very horrible today, right? And then assets are also data to kind of spin off of, IP addresses, host names, and physical stuff. Assets could also be data, right? A database. A share that has a particular kind of data could have multiple assets, right? I also think of that in inclusion of my asset management, that where I store my data is also an asset. A SAN, again, a network share, whatever, is also an asset. Switch, router, devices.
Software version,
devices, software. So
certificates. Now I'm in the process of updating our certificates. Those are also assets that have to be managed, and in smaller organizations such as ourselves, right? To go to a DigiCert or another certificate provider that offers management, right, is probably not within our scope. So we have to manage those certificates as assets, and those are hard, as I'm discovering, because I forget that every 5 years you update your certificate, and I'm like, wait, where did where is the key? Was there a password on that? I have to generate the CSR. Was it for that domain? Right? Like that's hard. It's another, I think, instance of an asset that you have to track.
Well, and not that I was setting up a deeper conversation, but you know, I wasn't even going that way initially. But you're underscoring the fact that while spreadsheets are a poor way to keep track of asset inventory, and maybe we're about to be proved wrong with the forthcoming demonstration. But how do you, you know, we both worked for Tenable.
Sure.
You know, how does a vulnerability scanning technology capture all of those things that you were just describing beyond IP address and maybe a few applications here and there?
Yeah, I know, and I think those much of that, in my experience, having used many of the vulnerability scanning and management tools, right, not just Tenables, is kind of buried in those results, right? It's your ability to having to run those scans on a regular basis and parse the results. Because inside those results, it's not only just like, hey, you have this host and it might be mapped to this host name. Maybe it's got these other, you know, domain names associated with it. But I found this certificate on this system and this certificate on this system, and then there was this share on that system. So inside there is a lot of the information to map many of the things we talked about beyond just, you know, IPs and host names.
I wonder about, you know, how much you can do with automation. I mean, I was having a conversation with a group that was working on an automated configuration management database, and they wanted to use the discovery tool that went with it, but to license the discovery tool for their organization was going to be about $1 a year, which is
Yeah.
I worked with another one where they have, you know, if your system isn't registered in the CMDB with its criteria being satisfied, you won't get a DHCP address, which means they did some work on integration between the two services, which I'm not sure everybody has the stomach for. I mean,
that's a big project, right? And one that, if I think back to university days, we had to some capacity, right? Like as switch ports came online, there's a MAC address associated with that, and you could have software that could pull that and then pull that into your inventory. And that's definitely been a thing over time for understanding what's on your local network. I mean, I'd even go so far as to say in a large network like that, you want to know about networks from your routing table and also the switches behind them. So the network is
wireless.
definitely, and wireless too is another whole.
Yeah, that's interesting. You bring that up, and I hadn't really thought about it in a long time. But in the old days, there was network monitoring tools that would do much of what you were describing that weren't security related products at all.
Yeah, they were just for an inventory, right?
Yeah, you know, well, it was more for network health. Are the, you know, we know that we have 100 servers. Are they all alive? Are they responding to pings or heartbeats, or you know, is the, you know, network traffic looking normal? I mean, it was all very much oriented towards operations. But some very, and I assume they're still out there. We just don't talk about them a whole lot.
Agreed.
But,
yeah, and I think Tyler's still here. He could probably speak best to this. In the Windows Active Directory world, right, maintains its own database of assets, not just Windows host names, right, Windows names, but other assets within the Active Directory domain, largely in terms of shares, credentials, you know, what have you.
Right.
Well, go ahead, Lee.
I was going to say, on the other end of the scale, we have the cloud infrastructure, where you have an absolute inventory of everything that's in your cloud account. But what you don't necessarily have is a correlation to what that item is for and what security constraints apply to it.
Well, and interesting you say cloud account singular, right? Because I think that solutions today, in my assessment, can do a really good job of, if you know what your cloud account is singular, can help you, you know, gain a great inventory of what's on there. What my concern is, anyone with a credit card can go spin, and an email address can go spin up a new cloud account. And how do you know how many cloud accounts you have, plural? I think is really where the danger, especially now people are working from home, so they've got your corporate card that's not traversing the network, and they're spinning up new cloud accounts. How do you know how many you have and what access is there?
I want to interject real quick because Lee's done it twice now, and I don't mean to be picking on you, Lee, but you've alluded to configuration management and keeping things current. Are we including that in the definition of asset management? Which it's fair to say yes, it's fair to say no, but this thing is ballooning really quickly if we're not limiting our definitions, because
My
those are
apologies for
important
stretching
activity.
scope, but
Well,
it-
scope creep.
Yeah.
Shame on you.
that's me.
But my point being, those are distinct activities, and
Absolutely.
I have resisted up until this point of calling PCI, but because Qualys has pretty much in a very large way made a name for themselves within the PCI industry, I think it's fair to compare all of this discussion to the PCI data security standard at some point. To that end, I will simply say asset management is described within the PCI standard as asset inventory, and you are required to maintain an asset inventory for your cardholder data environment. Now, more generically, I would say most companies, whether they're doing PCI or not, tend to have a production network that they isolate or segment from, the user network, the general population type of thing. There's various ways of slicing and dicing, and they try to make sure their asset inventory is accurate for, let's just say, production. We don't have to call it a card data environment.
And I would say, in kind of transitioning to the next topic, that even large enterprises that are extremely diligent about security controls, knowing what they have, are still concerned that even with all of the procedures and tools and integrations in place, that they're missing, that 1 or 2%, and that's what keeps them up at night.
Hold that thought. Let's move on to another topic of your 4.
Sure. So vulnerability management. And the question that I want to kind of lead into with vulnerability management is, do we need to know about all the vulnerabilities in our vulnerability management program? Is that because I think in the past we very much have kind of compared solutions and what you have in terms of vulnerability management as to how thorough it was in discovering all the vulnerabilities. Jeff, I think you and I had this conversation on a recent show in some capacity, right?
Right. Yeah, I think we have.
Do we need all of them? And whether we do or we don't, what's the best approach to finding what we need to find in terms of vulnerabilities in our environment?
Right.
I can stab at something on that.
Yeah,
Sure.
Tyler, as someone who takes advantage of these vulnerabilities.
Well, and again, let's before Tyler jumps in, let's have a quick working definition of what we're talking about when we say vulnerability management.
Yeah, and I would put that to both missing patches as well as misconfiguration in my vulnerability management. I would definitely lump those two things together, especially today.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think this is one of those very difficult kind of prioritizations by corporations. One, because there's a lot of misconceptions around high versus critical versus low, and how to hey, we're only going to hit all the highs as part of our vulnerability management because that's all we have capability to do and all the staff we have to do. Great. You probably should hit those highs, and you should be dealing with vulnerabilities as best you can across a whole organization. To kind of caveat that from an attacker standpoint, I almost always rely on the fact that there are going to be 1 or 2 or 3 very low misconfigurations, because it's fairly rare unless it's blatant or I find it, some other way that there's a vulnerability that has an exploit that's a 10. And if there is, it's usually not one I'm looking for right out the gate, because it's usually a little bit noisier. So I'll chain 2 or 3 low misconfigurations or vulnerabilities together in order to achieve either the same objective or even better objective. So as an organization, how do you know which of those to prioritize if you don't have someone testing against that has that kind of, here's where an attacker would go, here's what they'd be seeing, here's how they would leverage those 3 low ones that are easy to fix, but they're on the low and they're not going to be prioritized because you got these highs over here, which probably won't get exploited because of something. So how do you figure out those paths without having that kind of testing and kind of continual evaluation of what you're looking at. So it's kind of a hard problem.
I think and I'm going to make this sound easy, and it's not, right? But you need to pay attention to, at least you need to be able to find the relevant vulnerabilities to your environment, right? And I make that sound easy. It's certainly not. How do you know what determine what's relevant and what's not? I mean, certainly there's the most easiest criteria, which is, do I have this software or condition or not, right? In other words, if this condition is in a piece of software that I don't have, that's easy, right? If this condition is in a piece of software that has this specific feature that I'm not using and it's in that configuration, then I don't need to worry about it, right? Those are some of the easier things to help whittle down to what are the relevant vulnerabilities that I then have to go prioritize, right? So I think that vulnerability management is all about finding the relevant stuff, not everything, but the relevant stuff. And prioritization is then prioritizing everything that is relevant or applicable to my environment. Jeff.
So I'm going to get philosophical a little bit, and if I'm old and wrong and outdated, so be it. But I think that you finally said the word that I've been waiting to hear, because I think this is key to defining vulnerability management, and that's, what does it mean to find a vulnerability? Because you and I worked for a vulnerability scanning product company. That's what Qualys is. They were competitors. We used to beat up on them in our marketing meetings, and we were out to beat them and all that kind of stuff. But the argument that I always had at Tenable, and the argument that I look forward to having with Qualys, is, and I will read it to you as a requirement. Vulnerability management is one of the 6 sort of major themes of the PCI data security standard. The overall, the actual name for it is maintain a vulnerability management program. There's 2 major requirements that fall under that overall goal. That's requirement 5, which largely addresses antivirus, anti-malware solutions, and requirement 6, which is where you talk about establishing risk rankings, discovering vulnerabilities. They actually use the word identify vulnerabilities, patch management, change management, secure coding, secure code training for your developers, that make sure you're not screwing up on the OWASP top 10. That's all lumped together under vulnerability management. Sure. So my question is, quite frankly, the whole world seems to think that the way you start vulnerability management is by running a scanner to find your vulnerabilities. PCI, and this is the exact wording that they use. Requirement 6.1 says, establish a process to identify security vulnerabilities, using reputable outside sources for security vulnerability information, and this we'll come back to the second part later, and assign a risk ranking, for example, high, medium, or low, to newly discovered security vulnerabilities. I have always interpreted that statement as, and of course this is old-timey, but make sure you're subscribing to the bug tracks and firewall digests and whatever is out there, news groups, chat rooms, whatever, that's talking about vulnerabilities. And more commonly, I've seen that played out for my customers is, right or wrong, is relying on Patch Tuesday, the monthly patch release, or just more generically vendor disclosures. Because the way the system sort of works is somebody discovers a vulnerability, goes to the vendor, they work it out, they negotiate, and then they responsibly disclose once the patch is available. So the way most organizations learn about the vulnerability is when the patch is being released.
Right.
And understanding that's not the way it works all the time, but that's a lot of the way it works, right?
I get it, and I'm probably going to miss something, but the way that I think of it today, right, is the most fundamental thing is scan, look for air quotes vulnerabilities. I think the fundamental thing is to look for software in your environment that's out of date, right? Let's leave software development aside for a moment. Look for stuff that needs patches, right, is one thing. The next thing would be look for misconfiguration, which I would put as part of vulnerability management. I'm looking for misconfigurations. I think maybe a subcomponent of misconfiguration is authentication. in general, such as maybe missing passwords, weak passwords, default passwords, poor, credential management is part of the vulnerability. Like, I found an application that had a default password. To me, that's a vulnerability, right? So I think credentials and passwords and authentication have to play into the mix. When we start getting into software development, I look at software composition analysis. In other words, what components am I using in my software development process? Those could be libraries and or frameworks that have known vulnerabilities. And known is a whole segment in and of itself. But
you're not knowing those vulnerabilities because of a scan. You're knowing the vulnerabilities because of publication of stories, disclosures.
Maybe not an active scan as we traditionally think of it in vulnerability management, but as I build software and deploy software to different environments, there is an air quotes kind of scan, right? That's looking at, hey, you're including a Python library that has a known vulnerability in it, right? And so that's one component of it. And then the final component is, in terms of vulnerability management, is I'm a software developer and I introduced a vulnerability. It doesn't have a CVE. It doesn't have a version that I can tie back to. It doesn't have a patch that I can look for that's missing. Like, I introduced a vulnerability in my own software, and that needs to be addressed through multiple different things, right? Static analysis, dynamic scanning, and part of application security. And those are kind of the major buckets for me in terms of having a comprehensive vulnerability management program. I would also say, I would add on to PCI that says, high, medium, low, that those risk rankings need to be applicable to you as an organization, right? They need to take into account, right, all of those different things, like how sensitive is the data on there, and do I have that version of software, and do I have compensating controls, and all those things we've talked about in terms of assessing what's my risk, what is what is taking into account the threats in my environment, what is the risk of this vulnerability, and there's multiple factors that play into that. And a lot of solutions out there. Some people have their own solutions. They've grown them and built themselves. Others use multiple tools from multiple different vendors and integrate them together to get to that question of where we're about to go to next, right? Which is prioritization. How do I assign that risk rating and assign a prioritization to say what's more important than the other thing that I found?
Well, and it's funny because what I just read to you, which is requirement 6.1, which talks about assign a risk ranking, it is stating, this should be your own organization's risk ranking.
Okay, good.
Which is prioritization.
Sure.
And that language has been in there. I don't know if it was in version 1, but I'm pretty sure it came in version 2. So it's been around for at least 10 years within the PCI standard, but nobody ever looks at that. And I can't tell you how many friends I made with how many of my customers that were struggling to remediate all the high-risk vulnerabilities on their internal vulnerability scans, and I would come back to them and say, well, what's your risk ranking? And they're like, well, it's whatever the scanner says. I'm like, well, that's where you're missing the mark, because you shouldn't be relying. You don't need to. It's not required for you to rely on what the scanner tells you is the risk ranking. You've got this opportunity, and I would flip it open and point. I always carried a hard copy of the thing, and so I could point it to them and say, here's where it says you get to decide whether the vulnerability is high, medium, or low risk. All that they require is that you don't make that judgment call on the fly, on the spot, on a case-by-case basis. You have to have some sort of published criteria, a process that says, here's the 6 things that make something a critical. Here's the 10 things that make it only a high. Here's the, whether it's condition, location, segmentation, authentication, two-factor, whatever it is. Publish it ahead of time, apply it, and the most egregious critical vulnerability, if it's somewhere in the internal bowels of your network and only 2 people have access and it's two-factor authentication and all that kind of stuff, guess what? You don't have to worry about it.
And the one thing that I think most organizations don't get, and Tyler, and this has to be a frustration with you and all pen testers, right, is the impact. And I think that's where we say, like, pen testing can help you reduce risk, right? And people are like, well, it all depends on the remediation. But I also think that where pen testing plays in is bringing to life that impact, right? Because I may classify something as whatever risk ranking and make an assumption about the impact. And what things like pen testing do is really bring to light that impact and help me and the organization understand the true impact of those vulnerabilities and exposures that we've defined, right? And I think that's an important process. It's part of the fair risk assessment, which I very much love. But impact is somewhat subjective, right? And that's where I think many organizations, and Tyler can, and the rest of us can probably attest to that, right? In our days as pen testers and assessing security, is I think the number one thing we found is there is at least one or two things that you find during that process where they've gotten the impact wrong, where they've said, yeah, we have that. Yeah, it might be high, medium, low, or whatever, but we're not going to fix it because there is really no impact, right? And you come along as a pen tester and you're like, no, there is.
Yeah, that goes back to that attacker's mindset, right? Like that's why they pay us to do what we do. If it was always up to the defensive team or to, the people that are deciding on these, they have a very subjective view of their network. It's probably better than ours, and they probably are much better educated around all the caveats, but it is also subjective to how they think an attacker attacks and what they think the impact is likely, or even the likelihood for that matter. So you end up with something where that impact has to be demonstrated. If you demonstrate it and you have and provide evidence via screenshot or impact or chaining together attacks, it's pretty hard to argue. At the end of the day, we are analysts. We provide the information. It is your job to look at that from the business risk standpoint, and we'll provide our level of impact and risk and provide that a high, medium, low. Then you take that into your business risk appetite and apply that to the business overall and what that actually is doing for the business. And that's when you can start to get into that kind of subjective and make your own decision around what that risk is, because we're, again, only providing you one piece of that puzzle in an organization.
Well, I agree with what you're saying, Tyler. I was going to say to Paul initially, risk in and of itself is subjective, but that's not technically true. Risk is it's elusive and it's somewhat, we fudge it, but if you look at the risk equation, it is based in theory on variables that you can calculate and you can come up with a score,
right?
Whatever the algorithm is.
Right.
What is subjective is your risk tolerance, whether you accept it or not. I was going to add to what Tyler said, though. We had one more element, at least back on the DoD, when we were looking at the risk. Impact was certainly one of the elements that we added to the base equation of what are your threats, what are your vulnerabilities, what are your mitigations. The other one was likelihood.
Likelihood is a big one, Jeff. You're right. Yeah, probability and likelihood.
And we did it from two different perspectives. The likelihood that if somebody attempted the attack, it would work.
Yep. And
then also the likelihood that somebody could actually get to the point where they could actually try to do the exploit.
Yep. Agreed.
How exploitable is the exploit, right?
Yeah, but I think what's important in a great segue, right, is to our last section, which is patching, right? And what I've always been a big fan of, having worked in vulnerability management, having defended organizations, having attacked organizations, like what I come down to when it comes to remediation, largely patching, is one factor in there, right, is the ease at which I can implement a fix. And my philosophy has always been, if it's easy, like don't score all those other factors, give them a lot of weight. If it's easy, like just apply the fix. We also have to take into account the impact of the fix, right? And so I kind of liken this to also writing software that I'm rolling out to all of you, right? And when someone brings up a bug or a feature, like how easy or difficult is it to implement that bug or feature, and how much regression testing am I going to have to do in order to implement that? So if you find a bug where I'm like, yeah, it's pretty easy to fix, and I'm not going to have to regression test the entire application, right, to know if it's going to break stuff. Like I know it's pretty isolated inside the code. Like let's just fix it, right? And I think that's one factor in patching that many enterprises don't take into account. And it speaks to reducing your attack surface, is that if it's easy and it's low impact, if you apply the fix, just fix it.
The
Right?
places,
I agree
the
with
places I
you.
see-
Me first. I'm older than you, Tyler, a little bit.
Seniority.
I agree with you to some degree, Paul, but the real world that I lived in for so many years, a lot of times it was an excuse. Well, we
Right.
can't patch because it's going to break things.
Yep,
but
I
they
agree. It
don't
can go
really.
the other way, Jeff.
But they
Yep.
don't really know.
Mhm.
But what I was going to, tweak a little bit about what you were saying, though, is, and I actually wrote it down. We almost need to come up with an easy equation as in a companion to the risk equation. I mean, I had retail customers that were nationwide customers that, to be able to push out more times than not a Microsoft patch to, Target was not my customer, but we've probably all been to Targets. How many cash registers are there in a typical Target? Maybe 30 or 40, 50
There's
of
a
them.
whole row. If I can even remember the last time I was in a Target, right?
Well,
There's like
or any
30
store,
registers,
for that matter.
right? And they're too deep, right? So you multiply
Right.
the number of lanes times 2 in a
Right.
Target, right?
Right. Now, and plus there's the pharmacy counter what I've been into a Target, there's all ancillary, the Starbucks, which is probably the Target
separate,
version of Starbucks, but it's the Target point of sale. Multiply that by how many Targets you have in your town, county, state, so you're talking about, and they got to push all these patches out from a central server at headquarters somewhere. I mean, I had a very similar retail customer. Is the patch going to break anything? No. Is it easy to install it? Yeah, once, but try to distribute it out to 10,000 or 20,000 remote systems, and not all the lanes are open all the time, so are the systems even powered up all the time? They have extra that they roll out for the holiday surge. I mean, there's layers to easy, but I think the most common one was, and I think it's legitimate to some degree if they take it seriously, how do I know whether if I install this patch, if it's going to break anything?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of goes to one of the big things when we see easy, and I've seen this on lots and lots of red team and purple team assessments where we're really working with security team, is you run into, in many of these large corporations, change management, which they have a change window, and then you run into asset owners that maybe infrastructure or core routing or the server team, they own this asset. They have a different change procedure. They have a different window. They have a different testing variants, and they've got to do all of this testing that then has to go to the dev team that has to make sure that the code running on that server works. And then you have the education piece where you're trying to explain why this has to be done, even though that we got a firewall up front. This server is not accessible technically, and then a remote accessibility to that. So you end up having all of these pieces that end up playing into that, and you're trying to explain to them, no, like we literally right now should be able to just change this one setting on this default password on this copy machine that I just assessed from the internet, and I wrote a RAT for it that allowed me to pivot into your network. Oh, and the creds for the domain admin were stored in there for a scanning folder, and now we own your infrastructure. Like, just change this one thing and don't go through that process because it's such a big risk. That easy factor was there, but they couldn't do it because of policy.
Yeah, and I think carving up those different kind of buckets, if you will, in your especially larger enterprises, right? And
they're not buckets, they're silos.
Silos. You're very right, Jeff. Yeah, it's very accurate.
I'm dead serious.
Yeah.
They're silos.
And so maybe you have those silos, right? Inside of those silos, you have buckets. And when you push a patch out, right, you don't want it to go to all the silos and all the buckets at once. You want to start with maybe one silo and one bucket within there, make sure that goes okay, and then slowly phase it out. And I mean, that's going to look different in every organization, but most enterprises I've spoken with about, the issue of patching, which Qualys is built right into their platform, and they're one of the unique players to do that. And I always push for that in all the VM solutions, right, is if you can find a vulnerability, you can apply the patch for me, right, which is, I think, really awesome. But you don't want to do that across the board, especially in any even medium enterprise, right? You want this to be a rollout, right? And you want to be able to stop it if it does start to cause problems and be able to remediate that. What's interesting inside of that whole process, we interviewed the CISO for LogMeIn. LogMeIn does all of the GoToWebinar, GoToMeeting, GoToTraining, as well as LastPass and other properties that also include remote management of workstations. And he said that which I think is a great aspect to this is, not only do we phase a rollout of a patch, but we also have the facility that if a patch does break something, that we can remote into that system and potentially remediate. So, having kind of that contingency planning to say, if this patch does go wrong, I've got the ability to either back out and or remediate, but also, especially when everyone's working from home now because of the crisis, be able to access those workstations remotely, provided that patch doesn't break the remote accessibility, aspect, which I'm assuming you've tested somewhere else, right? I thought that was a great kind of aspect to it, is having kind of those backup plans and those escalation procedures to make sure that you can update software to, again, to your point, Jeff, make it as easy as possible, right? As resilient as possible to push out fixes for vulnerabilities.
Yeah, my only other, I keep laughing because I think about my last customer. Not only are there silos, but there's process, and all the silos have to do their thing in a particular order.
Yep.
And they would love to, well, we didn't get the memo from so and so, and it hasn't been done, so we can't do anything, and we're waiting on this. And it was everybody's fault and nobody's fault, and nothing's getting done. And
and
I mean,
that's Gene Kim's book, The Unicorn Project, exemplifies that, right? And speaks of ways to overcome that, but also highlights how much of that a problem that is not just for security, right, but for the growth of the business.
Right. Which is why I'm thinking of that, why I chuckled when you were like, oh, it's easy. I'm like, no, it's not easy.
Not always easy. Easy is a matter of perspective, right? Certainly.
Yeah. Which is why I thought we need to come up with an easy equation with 4 elements, or, similar to a risk equation. I'll work on that.
Right. And I mean, the other aspect of patching too is we see it here, again, I mentioned we have locally a few, couple dozen systems, right? When we look at our own patching program, we look at, that system didn't reboot, right? Or did that patch really take effect? And there's all those other nuances to patching, which is why it has to be this repeatable process of discovering new assets, doing the vulnerability management and discovery of all those vulnerabilities, prioritizing, remediating, and then, like we've always said about vulnerability management, being able to repeat that process, because there's so many variables in this process of, I just found a system today. Case in point, something went wrong and it wasn't able to resolve host names, therefore patches weren't getting applied because it couldn't resolve the host names to pull down the patches, and it was woefully out of date, so I had to fix that problem, and then, magically, patches are being applied. So there's a lot of edge cases here. Again, I'm talking about a couple dozen systems. Now you extrapolate that out to tens of thousands of systems, and you've got that problem at scale.
So I would be remiss if I did not bring the PCI angle of patching into this discussion, which happens to be PCI requirement 6.2. Right after you do the risk ranking and identify all your vulnerabilities, you patch the ones that are critical within 1 month of release, and they even say it's critical based on the criteria you came up with in requirement 6.1.
Right.
But because companies defer to their scanners, you got all these companies running around trying to fix all the critical vulnerabilities that the scanners I've identified, whatever that CVSS,
CVSS, right?
Whatever the number is, 8 and higher, 9 and higher, whatever. Yep. But where they get really confused, and I used to argue this, this was one of my big contentions at my time at Tenable, PCI also has a requirement, which is way later, to do a vulnerability scan both externally and internally. And to pass the external vulnerability scan, you have to fix 4.0 and above, which is effectively medium, highs, and criticals. But that's just external, which is different from the internal vulnerability scanning requirement, which says keep scanning until you fix all high vulnerabilities. So you've got 3 different requirements different focus areas and doing different things, but most people just, I scan to identify and I patch based on what I have to do. But one requirement says medium, one requirement says high, and one requirement says critical. And all three of them are supposed to be based on your own definition of what those risks are, which nobody does.
Two concerns there. One is we could almost do a whole other segment on attack surface management, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of great vendors and open source tools exist to do that. And how do you classify a finding that someone's cloned my website and doing phishing attacks? Is that a vulnerability? Like, what risk ranking does that have? And that's kind of interesting. And there's lots of different attacks that attack surface management companies are finding that I think is a very interesting component to this. And again, probably a different segment. The other concern that I have is if internally you're chasing around, I gotta fix everything that's critical, right? And you're not focusing on, my service accounts have a weak password and configuration that allows folks like Tyler and others to come in and basically do whatever they want inside the domain because they're now domain admin. Why isn't that a higher finding than I'm missing some critical patch that's maybe installed on one system, right? Where my attack surface internally might be, I've got this one service account that lets an attacker do whatever they want internally. And it's just really kind of flip-flopped, which is why I'm a really big fan of just fix it, right, in terms of a patch, but also looking at things like MITRE ATT&CK framework and other things that are identifying, well, this configuration is really your 10.0 criticality rating, not necessarily that, yes, missing 10.0 patch 08067 on that one system, which should be fixed, right, but all of the rest of your systems suffer from this misconfiguration in Active Directory, misconfiguration of a service account that isn't getting a high enough risk ranking because it depends on the context, right? And it's tough for the scanner, for example, to assign a risk rating to something that is very contextual. Because, Tyler, I'm sure you've never walked through a network with a service account, right? And how do you classify that?
That's not a thing.
It's not a thing.
Nope. It does become difficult, and honestly, from a defense side, like I did the defensive side for a decade, and it is hard to prioritize and be pulled in 100 directions and have politics and day-to-day demands, and then think for roadmaps and technology implementations and upgrades and your next round of whatever you're doing for Susie down the hall that asked for that new copy machine, and evaluating the next servers for new storage that's going to be a requirement for the new MVR system that's going to have to get pulled out.
To that point, something that always gets me and puts me in a bad situation security-wise, right, even being, security person for 20 plus years, is, well, that's going to be end-of-life. And my guess is 3 months, right? And then 6 months goes by, 8 months goes by, a year goes by, and we're still working on it. It's still a project, and I feel like that's something that enterprises suffer from at scale. If we suffer from it as a smaller organization, certainly I have spoken with enterprises that suffer with it at scale. How do you assess the risk and the vulnerability and the impact when you're like, yeah, that should be end of life, when you're guessing at when that end of life is going to be, and there's so many external factors that play into when that will actually be end of life and pose no risk, right? But that goes on for months or a year or better.
Yeah, I think one of the guys in the Discord live chat was mentioning that the Rapid7 vulnerability management takes and prioritizes those vulnerabilities and the impact they will have, taking 1,000 lows and making a bigger difference than fixing those 5 criticals, or fixing this one critical versus these 3 criticals, because the impact and ease of doing that is available, and there's a metric that weighs some of that out, which is kind of interesting in and of itself, how they do that. But. No,
certainly, and I think across the board, vulnerability management vendors and the whole subset of that industry that are, analyzing that data, which is a whole other classification. I've done a much better job, and they all have a different take on how they're helping organizations prioritize and giving you the tools to customize that. So, no, I think that's really good. I do, just in the interest of time, Jeff, maybe closing thoughts?
Well, I just wanted to sort of address configuration management or misconfigurations because you've brought it up a little bit again in a PCI context. PCI requires you in another section to securely configure everything you put on your network, systems, applications, and whatever. And you're supposed to do it based on an industry accepted standard. And we would, as QSAs, go in and say, show us what you're building to, and then let's take a look at systems and see if you're doing it. That being assumed that that's sort of how you put systems on the network, then it falls to how do you find misconfigurations, assuming that you started out with secure configurations. That typically comes through vulnerability scanning, although it's not specifically required. And from our time at Tenable, I learned that Nessus does a lot better job or is more focused on configuration when you're doing an authenticated scan. Actually, and even the agents that they had, at least when we were there, the agents in the authenticated scans were much more configuration checkers than they were doing vulnerability scans. In fact, I shouldn't have been surprised, I guess, but I was surprised when they first rolled out the agents that was doing configuration checks. You couldn't install that on a system and call that as passing a vulnerability scan because it wasn't doing vulnerability scanning because it was already on. It was just doing the configuration checks. That might be one possible, quote me if you want to record the date, problem with the PCI standard. Certainly a fair criticism that there is no clear guidance from the PCI standard on doing an unauthenticated versus an authenticated scan for the actual scanning criteria.
And I think, vendor aside, there are subtle differences just in the inherent nature of how you check for vulnerabilities on a system, whether that be remote or whether that be local, right? There are subtle differences. Like remotely, I can get to certain things that locally I may not be able to get to or fully assess that, right? And that's across all vendors. And all of at least 3 major vendors in this space have an agent that's very much matured since the last time we worked at Tenable, Jeff, right?
I hope.
and have better and different capabilities, right? And all of which can assess that configuration data and patch data, but all have those kind of subtle differences as just remotely you're going to get slightly different stuff, right? So with that, I do want to transition into Sumed's demo, which is really awesome. I got a preview of it. And, again, all these things we talked about, Qualys is addressing in some capacity in their platform to create that closed loop in vulnerability management doesn't, encompass all of what they're doing, right? There's aspects of everything that we talked about in the Qualys solution. So Sumed will come on next to give that assessment. And then after that, we will conclude the show. I will conclude the show now and then just transition into Sumed's demo. How about that? So
let's do it that way.
Thanks, everyone. Over and out. And stay tuned for a demo from Sumed from Qualys.
So here you can see the brand new UI that we are rolling out for everybody who's upgrading to VMDR. And as I mentioned earlier, the 4 pillars of effective vulnerability management program, which is identifying assets, discovering vulnerabilities, prioritizing your threats, and deploying the patches. So this UI uniquely brings all of that together in a single workflow, in a single app. And there's a nice little video in that circle that you can see to get an idea of how the whole thing works end to end, but it's pretty easy workflows. Of course, as I mentioned, part of VMDR, the first aspect is identifying all of your assets and being able to do that with multiple different ways. At the bottom, there's scanners, passive scanners, so many additional ways to get your inventory. But we can start off by giving a demo of how easy it is to leverage the Qualys Cloud Agent, because it brings a lot of rich inventory information from the devices in real time, especially now with remote endpoints being everywhere, and provide that unique visibility. So let me see if I can zoom this thing a little bit. And I highly recommend that if you can do that in your browser, there you go. So if you can do that in your browser to make it full screen, you definitely should do that. So here you can see a little bit better the UI. You can start off by clicking download Cloud Agent. Unlimited Cloud Agents are included for inventory for free. Let's take an example of Windows. Very easy, simple, lightweight 3 megabyte agent that you can download and essentially distribute this with a very simple command line argument. There's a few ways you can do that. We have customers who are using existing solutions for deployment of software, cloud-based solutions like Intune, and a few others. So we have a blog out there that explains many different ways to get the agent installed. Once it's installed, the good thing is that it auto updates, it keeps itself updated, and you never really have to go and update the agent again. So it's a completely self-updating and self-managed agent. And if you want to take a look at it, there's also the other section on Azure Security Center agent, which is built in. So that's another aspect of the agent installation. But let's focus on the Windows one. So once you get those agents installed, you will be able to come back here and it'll start populating your dashboard, which I'm going to show. That dashboard essentially brings together all of the various elements of asset inventory throughout your entire enterprise in one single view. So it starts off with a distribution of all of your operating systems, gives a category breakdown of cloud assets, network devices, laptops, printers, any of your IoT type devices, desktops. So everything is brought together in a single view. You can see the complete distribution, categorization. So as I mentioned earlier too, the big part of what we do, our inventory, is not just collect raw information and show that. We highly normalize and categorize that information, which is why today when you look at the remote endpoints as an example, you can quickly see here all of your client hardware and all of your client operating systems. So what kind of actual laptops are out there across the entire remote workforce? As an example, you can see that across different models, how many assets do you have? Operating systems the same way. Windows 10, do you have any outdated Windows 7 as you have in this case? Are all of your Mac agents updated to Catalina or Mac devices updated to the latest version as well? If you scroll down here, you can see all of your remote endpoints on a map because being a cloud-based solution, we can keep track of where these devices are and show them in near real time. Before I go there, another interesting thing here is today you see there's a lot of software out there that is malware, rather I should say, out there that is targeting VPN vulnerabilities. And so the inventory that we have brings together all of the VPN endpoints that are installed inside the network that are being targeted or that have vulnerabilities. So you can very quickly get the full inventory of those as well. Now let's go on to the remote endpoints here. If you go over the map, you'll see the distribution of all the devices that you have in the different locations, different cities out there. We have a few in Paris. There's a big operation in Pune, so there's quite a few over there out in India. We could have one salesperson out in Japan, so there's that one single device out in Tokyo as an example. That you can keep track of where that device is and where it's connecting from. It's interesting, I see a device out here in Rio. Not sure if one of our employees is out there during the lockdown, or maybe it's a stolen laptop that's popped up in Rio. You can easily drill down further and investigate that. Furthermore, if you look at some of the client application categories, there's more detail out there in terms of productivity software, collaboration software, databases, end of life. You can track your overall security hygiene. The collaboration software, that part is quite interesting because that includes a lot of your licenses that are being used for everything from Word to PowerPoint to even collaboration includes all of your video conferencing software as an example. So let me scroll up here and then see if I can click on the notebooks. So there's about 1,200 or so notebooks Clicking on that will give the latest notebooks that are connecting, where they are, what's on those notebooks. We categorize very quickly on our own, provide information about the operating system, so you can see the Windows versus the Macs. But the really cool part of how all of this gets connected in a single workflow is the ability to then take these queries, the QQL queries that are part of our Elasticsearch, which I mentioned earlier, that's indexing the 3 trillion data points. You can take that and create a tag out of it, so you can use it later during your report. So in this case, I'm creating a simple remote endpoints tag based on anything that's a computer, and the category is notebook. So that way I can track all of them throughout the entire workflow. Once you've done that, you can switch over to the software. So this is one thing I mentioned earlier, that our agent really brings a lot of rich telemetry information about install software, and then we use the normalization categorization on our backend to explain exactly which of the software is security software, which is application content, what is productivity, and then look at all the vendors as an example. So being able to ensure that we can see across the vendor the different type of software out there. Can quickly come in here and categorize them. So here I'm categorizing that. And with that, I can see that out of the 46,000 plus software, there's collaboration and web conferencing, right? So as I mentioned earlier, collaboration category has different types of subcategories, and one of the categorization here is web conferencing. So for 1,200 laptops, there's 3,400 web conferencing software installed across those laptops, which is very interesting information. And from a breakdown perspective, there's about 1,100 of them are BlueJeans, there's Cisco WebEx, and as you know today, there's a lot of talk about the vulnerabilities that were discovered in some of the Zoom video conferencing software. So in this case, there's 187 Zoom video conferencing apps installed across those laptops. Clicking on that will bring us to a list of all of the various versions and how many devices out of those 187 are at the different versions. So I believe the 4.6.8 and below were the ones that were vulnerable. So in this example, you can see that a majority of the apps have been updated to the latest version, so that makes it a lot more secure. Again, I'm going to create a tag here so that we can use that later during the workflow. So here we're creating a tag called Zoom Endpoints, and here you can see the simple query that, again, as you notice that the query was created by just clicking through, and I didn't even have to type through for that query. That's how intuitive that UI is. So once you create the tag, then you can track it and use that tag later. So now let's go switch to the vulnerability workflow. So this is where I had mentioned going into the VMDR workflow. This is one of the new cool things we are releasing with VMDR, is completely customizable and unlimited dashboarding and ability to create real-time live widgets with trending information built in. So here, as part of the new VMDR interface, this is something that we're rolling out to pretty much all customers. Even though you are not a VMDR customer, this specific dashboarding capability will be pushed out to everybody over the next few weeks, because it really changes how you track your vulnerabilities and how you do vulnerability management directly out of the box. So this default dashboard that we have built shows all the open vulnerabilities, fixed vulnerabilities, your enabled, disabled, rather ignored and disabled vulnerabilities, tracking the agents. You'll see a lot more discussion that we do about the age of these vulnerabilities. So we can look at the age of these detections, how long ago were a lot of these vulnerabilities detected. The favorite things that people like to do, your top 10 vulnerabilities, your top 10 hosts, which tags those hosts belong to, being able to drill down and find out which host has the most number of vulnerabilities. It's all extremely customizable and very easy to build multiple widgets on a dashboard. I'm actually going to show you with an example. So if I go here, let me pick a name for this. And let me create the query. So it's a very simple query. essentially anything that is a vulnerability that is found in the last 30 days and has a CVSS base score between 7 and 10. And the first time that it was ever found was in the last 30 days. So this excludes vulnerabilities that were found a long time ago and maybe have been opened or reopened or whatever it is. So very granular ability to create these widgets. And as you saw, immediately it shows up with the count. I can check a box, and this is one of my favorite features. You don't have to pull the data out into some other Tableau or some other places like Splunk or any other SIEM solutions to try to do trending on this information. That is automatically now built in as part of this new interface. You can go in here, just check the box, and then say add to dashboard, and that widget will now be on the dashboard in a matter of seconds. So now when you scroll down here, let me scroll down here. Okay, there you go. You see the widget right there. So going back up, I'm going to show another example, which is a little bit more in depth, but another example of creating a widget by using the example of the CVE, which was the Crypto API, Microsoft Crypto API vulnerability that came out, I think, last month, where it was one of the really key vulnerabilities that needed to be highly prioritized, and everybody wanted to keep track of the burn down of how quickly they were patching that particular vulnerability. So by being able to create that widget very easily. And another thing I wanted to mention, if you look here at the top, you can actually view the information, change the widget types as a pie chart or as a table or a bar chart very quickly just by clicking through those options. I'm going to focus right now on a number widget. The cool thing here is that you can basically create very easy ways to draw attention for those who are tracking these different types of tracking widgets. You can really click on each one of those and then be able to find out the detailed information. But then if you have a lot of widgets on a dashboard, how do you find out which ones are the ones that need your attention? So you can very easily come in here and then create very simple rules that say, maybe in the case that the number of endpoints in my environment is greater than a certain value. So in this case, I'm going to take the value of 10. So if the number of devices that have that is over 10, then it needs to turn yellow. Now, if I say that the number of devices goes beyond the 10, and I can take another example here. So let's take the value here of saying that now if the number of devices, as we are tracking, the widgets are getting updated. So let's say 25 is a number, then it becomes orange. And you can go and add additional colors to get information, and then you can track the historic trending directly out of the box. And that's how easy it is. I could easily add another one here in different colors. But because these widgets are live, they're continuously tracking the values. And as soon as those values change, you can see the color change and draw your attention. And then we're adding additional capabilities soon to be able to do alerting based on these thresholds as well. So I added that widget here. So you can see the Crypto API widget is added as well. Once you've done that, the next thing here is really looking at the third aspect of it. Is you have a way now to detect vulnerabilities in real time and a way to keep track of those vulnerabilities by using these dashboards and widgets. But then the next aspect of this is really going to be about tracking threats. So one of the things that VMDR brings as part of this workflow is the ability to have a live feed of the latest threats that are impacting your organization. And that's the key term here, your organization. So as our threat researchers are doing research and adding different types of threats as part of that feed, the big aspect that is unique here is the ability for the platform to go in and immediately, as soon as this threat is pushed out, is to go and detect how many exact assets in your environment are impacted by that. So sometimes there could be a feed that has no assets that are impacted in your environment. In other cases, you can see on the left on the high feed here, that there's the Mac OS, there's the Firefox vulnerability here. You can look at the Zoom vulnerability. So the UNC path injection vulnerability, and I will talk about that later. Now, you want to fix what's on the left-hand side first, because that's exploitable, and we talked about the real-time threat indicators, which I'll showcase a little bit later as well, in addition to this. But once all of that is done, you can also start looking at the next level of prioritization, which is, it's not maybe a easily exploitable vulnerability in the wild, but you know that when there is a POC exploit, and that's why we kind of put this as a medium one, where the fact that a vulnerability now has some sort of a POC available, which means that it's probably the next step is going to be some sort of an exploit is going to come out in the wild, maybe as part of an exploit kit or something. So very easy ways to keep track. And again, the focus is on showing what is impacted in your organization, so that instead of just saying that this is a critical vulnerability, you can really focus on saying, how does it impact? Now, the next thing after you've looked at, kept track of the threats, is how do you operationalize this information and the RTIs and the asset context. And this is the really big cool thing that we have added, is leveraging the platform updates we have done, is to create a prioritization workflow that very easily leverages the tags that we created earlier. As I mentioned, again, to reiterate, those tags are kept up to date automatically by the system. So if new assets come on board and those assets have those tags, have those attributes, those tags will automatically be updated. So I'm going to go through a few examples here. So first example that I'm going to go through here is pick one of those tags that we had created earlier. So in this case, I'm going to pick the tag that we had created, which is the remote endpoint tag. Once I click the tag, it's immediately going to go and fetch the information to say, as you see in this case, that there's 1.68K assets that are part of that tag, which and on all of those assets, there's 34,000 vulnerabilities detected, and you can see the CVSS breakdown. But then we start to bring all the relevant information about that, right? So what's the detection age? And you can select that from here, whether you want to only focus on vulnerabilities that were detected a certain number of days ago, or then you come in here, you can see the real-time threat indicators. So there's a lot of them. There's 0 days, and again, these are very focused. So there's different ways that we provide customers to customize this prioritization to their environment. So we do some analysis, and additionally, there are things that the customers can choose here. So there's high lateral movement, high data loss, denial of service, and things like that. And so, the point here is that a lot of times other solutions tend to have issues with figuring out how to prioritize, because denial of service doesn't really make sense to prioritize that on a remote endpoint, as an example. But an exploit kit vulnerability, that actually makes a lot of sense to prioritize on an endpoint, because remember, when you have these remote endpoints that are out there, as soon as that device is now connected to the internet at home, it's being used by the kids to download PDFs, whatever it is. Exploit kits that are out there are actually leveraging vulnerabilities, and we keep track of all of the vulnerabilities that are in all of these popular exploit kits. And those you want to mitigate first, because it's very easy to send someone, embed an exploit kit as part of a PDF or an Excel sheet or a video, send it to someone, they open it. If the vulnerability is there, then they can own the machine immediately, right? So focusing for remote endpoints on vulnerabilities that are part of exploit kits gives a lot of granularity in picking what prioritization needs to be done. And then on the right hand side, you see all of the attack surface options. So we'll go a little bit more in depth through the rest of the demos, but here, again, because I talked so much, it took some time, but otherwise it's a very fast, within a couple seconds, we are going to go and do the full analysis to say, out of the 1,600 assets that are part of the remote endpoints, the ones that have vulnerabilities that are used in exploit kits is, you can see here on the left hand side, only 24. So you really need to focus on only those 24 prioritized assets. And there are 27 unique vulnerabilities on those 24 assets that need to be patched. And of course, to patch those, we have done the translation. I talked about that earlier, from the vulnerability directly to the exact patch on the exact machine. So there's 10 patches that need to be deployed across 24 assets to fix those 27 unique vulnerabilities. And that's really the power of what VMDR is about. It brings you the very quick analysis, prioritize with very quick, easy customizations as needed, give you the list of all of those vulnerabilities. You can look at it in different ways. You can look at it as vulnerabilities. You can look at it as patches. You can look at it as assets. So in this case, if I click on patches, now I can see the same list, but from a patch perspective. And so I can say, oh, this Firefox patch needs to be deployed. I can go ahead and say patch that now. But in the simplest workflow here is without having to worry about the different operating systems and the different versions and the architectures or anything like that. The big part of the response capability here is to have that ability to directly click here and say, add this to a new job, or kick off, create a new job. It will take some defaults, create a new job here. You can edit some of these things if you want from the asset perspective or the actual patches that are going to be deployed. But now we pick the tag, we pick the 10 patches that need to be deployed across all of those devices. And then you just have to go hit save. And now that patch will start rolling out to all of those endpoints as soon as they are connected to the internet. So again, remember, no need to go through VPNs because we pull the patches directly from the CDN vendors, and it's a full capability patch module with everything from being able to provide messages for what they should see when it comes up for a reboot, as an example, or to be able to schedule, to be able to roll back patches. So as you explore that, you will see that this is a full patch deployment capability that can really replace any of your entrenched patching modules as well. So once that is done here, let's go and take another example. So I will pick another tag. So let's take web services tag here, right? So web servers, I should say. Once you pick the tag, immediately it's going to go to do the same analysis, find the number of hosts that are impacted, find the total vulnerabilities that are impacted. So you will see here there are 75 assets that are impacted. You can see the age of the detections. And in this case, we're picking some RTIs like active attacks and vulnerable, because those are more concerning on your web servers, as an example. As soon as you prioritize, it's going to go and showcase, essentially bring the number of assets that are actually impacted. Now, if you see here, there are 75 total assets, and 68 of those, based on the default RTIs, need to be prioritized and patched. However, you can say now that in your environment, and because these are web servers, you care also about the denial of service threat indicators, so that we will go and figure out which of those. Now it's actually increased to 73 because we also added denial of service. Now you can take off some of these and you can say, I don't care about vulnerable, and the number will go down. But when you talk about the attack surface, remember I mentioned the attack surface is essentially a way to figure out the context of the asset and the vulnerability on them. So now, while there may be a lot of web servers and there are many different ways to detect vulnerabilities, you can detect it with agent, you can detect the vulnerability with scan, authenticated, unauthenticated scans. One of the things that you want to really prioritize here is to say, go to the attack surface and say, I only want to look at the remotely discoverable vulnerabilities, right? Which is vulnerabilities that are on my external facing web servers that don't need any authentication to detect them. Those are the highest priority. So now that goes down to 29. So these 29 assets are web servers that have vulnerabilities that can be remotely detected without authentication. And there are 4 patches available here that can be deployed. So there was a vulnerability that came out, I think that impacted Tomcat recently, called GhostCat. So here you can see very quickly that we can pick Tomcat on, and we can patch Tomcat leveraging the Qualys agent if you have the agent on the machine already. So very easy to create a job. So I'm going to go here. In this case, I will say add this to an existing job, and All right, are the demo guards going to give up on me? Oh, that does not look good. Oh, it's coming back. Okay. All right, just so you know that it's real. We're still a couple things we need to focus and work out on this, but overall it's working really well. Let's take another example. So let me clear out the web servers, and let's pick another tag that I had created earlier. So in this case, I'm going to say it's a data center asset. So it's not just web servers, there's a data center, and we pick the tag, and there are many assets in there. There may be routers, switches, databases, all kinds of different things, web servers. So you have San Diego data center. Okay, let me see. Oh, here, there you go. So now it's going to go and figure out that there's 242 assets in that. In this case, I actually care about the high data loss type of threat indicators, right? So now I can go and say, let me click and say, include all of the vulnerabilities that are known to be related to high data loss. And so now the prioritized assets is 56 out of the 242. So there's a 56 assets that need to be focused on, 94 unique vulnerabilities that can be fixed with 23 patches. Now, how do we look at the attack surface and narrow this down even further to say what is the first batch of things that you need to focus on? So one of the things we bring as part of VMDR now is the ability to know which of the vulnerabilities that are detected and the threats that are out there actually are unauthenticated exploits. So we talked about discovering vulnerabilities, but just because you remotely discover a vulnerability doesn't mean that it can be exploited remotely. Some of the vulnerabilities do require you to be on the box for exploitation. So now I can very quickly flip that and say, okay, I only want to focus on the ones that can be remotely exploited without authentication. So that brings that number down to 45 assets that need to be focused on. I can go further to say, once that exploitation has happened, which vulnerabilities actually lead to elevated privilege escalation. So different exploits do different things. So just because a vulnerability gets exploited may not necessarily always mean that there's a direct path to a privilege escalation. Here, because we bring that attack surface and we bring that additional information on the specific assets, now we can say, look at things like, show me only vulnerabilities that are on the running kernel, or only the ones that are on a running service. Don't show me things that are not on the running service or not on the running kernel, right? You find a vulnerability, it's on a kernel that's actually on the disk, not loaded in memory. That's not a high priority thing that you need to fix. Even if it was an exploitable vulnerability, that's not your first order. Here, anything that is unauthenticated exploitation, and if the exploitation leads to high privilege escalation, that's the list that you want to focus on. So now that's down to 44 hosts that need 13 vulnerabilities to be fixed with 2 patches that can be deployed. So again, pretty easily you can go and add that tag. I think we need to work on this messaging here. It needs to give a confirmation message when I click add, but we'll work on that. So next one I'm taking is an example of a database server. So here I pick database server, go click prioritize now. Here it's a very simple use case that I'm looking at, right? There's 219 database servers across the environment. And that's fine. There's databases are used for many different things, and 212 of those really need focus on them. But what I really care about is any database that is has a vulnerability or is known to be associated with malware, or current active attacks are going on against that particular vulnerability on that asset. But then I want to focus to say the first order is, what is the worst thing that can happen is a database that has one of these threat indicators is actually internet facing. So just by flipping that, because we bring the asset context, you can very quickly say, now that narrows down to 24 assets that have databases that have vulnerabilities that are remotely facing to the internet, and those absolutely need to be patched first. So here's another example of how you can leverage that ability to create those patches and push those patches out. Again, end-to-end, going from the asset identification through the tags, detection of the vulnerabilities, prioritization leveraging the RTIs, and then the response leveraging the patching capability, all brought together in a single workflow. So here, I can add this to an existing job. So, all right, so I go back to where we started again. So this is the last example I want to show, because this is again highlights what I mentioned earlier, that it's not just about the vulnerabilities, it's also about configurations and configuration related issues that cause, let me see the endpoints. Yeah, that's the Zoom endpoints that I picked earlier. So with that, now I can focus on things that maybe you cannot patch very easily, or patches are available but cannot be patched in the normal way. Zoom has an interesting way that they patch the vulnerability. So, and they did a fantastic job of very quickly coming out with a patch so that you could deploy, or because they have the apps, they can auto update the patching. So here in this case, when I hit prioritize now on my Zoom endpoints, here I'm selecting a different set of threat indicators that I care about, right? And so those are the you have the UNC injection vulnerability that came out, and they patched it very quickly. One of the ways that they have been patching this is that when you join the meeting, and after that meeting has finished, and you quit the meeting, at that time they show that there is a patch, and they ask you to patch now, and they do patch that. But that does leave a certain amount of time when those devices are vulnerable, because if someone sends you something to click on, and that can then leverage the vulnerability to actually try and exploit that vulnerability to get the information about the hash, and you can read up more information about that. But what happens in that case is that now you are still vulnerable, and the patch is being rolled out, but it's being rolled out in a manner that after you have finished the meeting, it will show up for the end users. In that case, there are other ways, and this is just one example, but many times, you have the 7 monkeys vulnerabilities, where you can mitigate that vulnerability with network level authentication, enabling a configuration option, which then mitigates the vulnerability. So a lot of times what happens is that just because a vulnerability detected by the scanner does not mean that the device is vulnerable, because the vulnerability can be mitigated by a configuration change on the box that has been done, that's in place. So if the configuration is in place, then you don't really prioritize that vulnerability. So one of the additional attack surface options we provide here is the ability to say, only show me the vulnerabilities that are not mitigated by configuration. So which means the vulnerability is detected by the agent or the scanner, but it has not been mitigated by a configuration change. So in the case of the 7 monkeys vulnerability, if the network level authentication was enabled, we would consider that the vulnerability is mitigated because of the configuration change. So in that case, we would not highlight that as a high priority vulnerability. So in the case of Zoom, is the same with NTLM, right? So you can basically go and check that, and so now it's going to show you only the vulnerabilities that are not mitigated by a configuration change. And so in this case, it's going to show you the configuration change that is needed. So it's not just about patching, but also if there are other ways that you can mitigate that vulnerability. So in this case, essentially it's option to say that you can actually restrict NTLM from going to remote servers, right? If you don't have that device allowing NTLM traffic to a remote server, then you are much better protected, because you're potentially not leaking your NTLM hash in that case, because it cannot go to a remote server. So that's simple, turning on that capability. So this is something that is in the works right now, is that extending that ability to take response action, going beyond applying patches, but also to create jobs leveraging the agent to fix misconfigurations on the box. So here you can create the job, pick the assets, and then you have the controls, and then you can go and say, apply that particular fix, and now you can, that job is going to go and execute, and is going to work on changing the configuration. So while the patch has not yet been deployed, you are still better off from a true risk perspective. And that's what it comes down to, right? Everything that I have shown up here is a risk-based approach towards vulnerability management. It's not just saying I use some machine learning, and that's one of the RTIs here, which is a machine learning predicted high vulnerability, which is just one of the RTIs, right? So we leverage machine learning in the right place to be able to say that this particular thing is something that can, based on machine learning, is highlighted as a vulnerability that can potentially become deadly in the future. But again, you want to focus on fixing what right now is actually exploitable, and then go to the machine learning aspect of it. So again, that flexibility, bringing that risk-based approach to really look at in your environment, and also within your environment, as I showed, different tags have different risk factors, and different RTIs are important to them, and different attack surface options are important based on your assets. So very flexible, very fast, backed by that super fast Elasticsearch database. We're able to really create different prioritization reports very quickly. And in the top, you will see that there is, on the top right, there is ability to export these to a dashboard. So we have created a new type of widget, which is the VMDR tracking widget. So because yes, you have your report and you create the job, but how do you track that particular the report that you just ran in a live manner? So again, leveraging the dashboard engine that we've created, we are now taking that and we have put this new widgets which tracks the progress of that particular example, those examples that I took. So you can see the burn down directly without having to pull this data out and track it somewhere else. So this is another big part of VMDR, which is end-to-end, starting with asset discovery, inventory, vulnerability management in continuous mode, threat feed, threat detection, and then ability to create customizable prioritizations that are very based on actual risk factors and very customizable. I think I said customizable, so I'm repeating that because it is very customizable. And that really gives you now this unique workflow. So very excited. This rolled out already, and we've enabled a bunch of our customers. We're getting a lot of good feedback on this, and really I hope you like the demo, and really looking forward to getting feedback.